The story of the end of the Viking Age is often tied to one day. Well, October 14th, 1066, on a small hill in southern England, an army was exhausted, and King Harald Godwinson stood with his men. They were the English army, but Harald was also the son of a Danish noblewoman, a product of the long Viking settlement in England. Just 3 weeks earlier, on September 25th, Harald had done the impossible. He had marched his army nearly 200 miles in about a week. He surprised a massive Norwegian army at a place called Stamford Bridge. The Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, a man known as the last great Viking, was defeated and killed. Harald's English army, using tactics honed over generations of fighting Vikings, had won a huge victory. But there was no time to rest. As soon as Hardrada was defeated, news came. Another army had landed in the south. This army was led by William, the Duke of Normandy. Normandy was a land in France settled by Vikings a century and a half earlier. Its people were descendants of a Viking chief named Rollo. They spoke French now and prayed in Christian churches, but their origin was Viking. So Harald, with his tired army, marched south again, another 250 miles. They met William's army near the town of Hastings. The battle lasted all day. It was brutal. Harold's men formed a shield wall on the top of the hill. The Norman knights on horseback charged up the hill again and again. They couldn't break the English line. The English were holding, but late in the day, something changed. Some say the Normans faked a retreat, luring some of the English down from the hill. Others say it was just the chaos of a long battle. But the shield wall broke, and in the fighting, King Harald was killed. An arrow to the eye, the story goes. With their king dead, the English resistance crumbled. William the Duke became William the Conqueror. This one day, this one battle, seems like a clean ending. The last great Viking invader, Hardrada, is defeated. Then the English king of Viking descent, Harald, is also defeated. The winner is a French-speaking duke whose great-great-great-grandfather was a Viking. The Viking Age in England, the age of raids and conquest from the north, was over, but it wasn't an end. It was a change. The story isn't about a fire going out, it's about the fire spreading and changing the landscape. The men fighting at Hastings were all, in some way, products of the Viking Age. The end was really just a new beginning. The Viking wasn't gone. He was now a king, a duke, a farmer, a merchant. He had transformed. Number 15, the last great invasion, was a royal affair. Harald Sigurdsson was a man who lived a full life. We know him as Harald Hardrada, which means hard ruler. He was born in Norway around 1015. His half-brother was King Olaf II of Norway. When Harald was just 15, he fought in a battle to help his brother keep his throne. They lost. Olaf was killed. Harald was badly wounded and had to flee. This was the start of his long journey. And he didn't just go back to a farm. He became a mercenary, a soldier for hire. He ended up in Kievan Rus, a state founded by Vikings. From there, he went to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. He joined the emperor's elite bodyguard, the Varangian Guard. This was a group made up almost entirely of Norsemen. For about 10 years, Harald fought for the emperor. He traveled to Sicily, Bulgaria, and the Holy Land. He was a brilliant commander. He was also very good at getting rich. The stories say he sent vast amounts of gold and jewels back to Kiev for safekeeping. By the time he left Constantinople in the mid-1040s, he was one of the wealthiest men in the north. He returned to Norway with his small army and his huge fortune. He used his wealth and his reputation to make a deal with the current king of Norway, his nephew. They would rule together. A year later, his nephew died, and Harald Hardrada became the sole king of Norway. For the next 2 decades, he ruled as his name suggested. He was a tough, effective king. He fought a long war with Denmark. He created a new currency for Norway. He established a new capital at Oslo. He was a Christian king, but he still had the old Viking spirit. He wanted more. In 1066, the King of England died without a clear heir. Harald decided the English throne should be his. This was not a small raid by a few chieftains in longships. This was a full-scale royal invasion. Harald gathered a huge fleet, perhaps 300 ships. He had an army of around 10,000 men. This was a state-sponsored operation organized by a powerful king. He sailed to England and was joined by Tostig Godwinson, the brother of the English King Harold. They won an early victory near York. But then came the battle at Stamford Bridge. King Harold of England had marched his army north with incredible speed. Harald Hardrada's army was caught by surprise. They weren't wearing all their armor. The battle was long and bloody. Hardrada, a giant of a man, fought at the front. He was killed by an arrow to the throat. His army was almost completely wiped out. Of the 300 ships that came, only about 24 were needed to take the survivors home. This event is often called the end of the Viking Age, but it shows the transformation perfectly. Hardrada wasn't a pirate chieftain looking for silver. He was a European king fighting for a crown. His army was a national army, not a band of adventurers. He was playing the same political game as the King of England and the Duke of Normandy. The Viking raid had evolved into a royal war. The scale had changed. The reasons had changed. The type of person leading the charge had changed. It was no longer about plunder, it was about kingdoms. The failure of this invasion marked the end of large-scale Scandinavian attacks on England. The Viking Age didn't end with a whimper. It ended with the clash of two powerful organized kingdoms led by men who represented the new, transformed Viking ideal. Number 14, an emperor in a prayer shawl. In the early 11th century, a man named Cnut ruled an empire. It was an empire of the sea. It included England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. He was, for a time, the most powerful ruler in Northern Europe. Cnut, or Canute, as he's often called in English, was the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, the king of Denmark. In 1013, Sweyn invaded England and conquered it, but he died just a few weeks later. This left his son Cnut in a difficult position. The English lords invited their old king back. Cnut, still a young man, was forced to flee, but he came back. In 1015, he returned to England with a large Danish army. For the next year, he fought a brutal war against the English king, Edmund Ironside. Eventually, they agreed to split the kingdom. Cnut would rule the north and Midlands, and Edmund would rule the south. But then, just a few weeks later, Edmund died. By the end of 1016, Cnut was the undisputed king of all England. The English probably expected a harsh ruler. They expected a Viking conqueror who would punish them and take their land. And Cnut did execute some of his English rivals at first. He had to secure his power, but then he did something unexpected. He began to rule not as a Viking conqueror, but as an English king. He issued a law code that was based on the laws of previous English kings. He promised to uphold the rights of the church. He paid off his large army and sent most of it home to Denmark. He kept a small force of elite bodyguards, his housecarls, but he relied on English institutions to govern the country. He divided England into 4 earldoms, giving power to both Danish and English nobles. He minted coins with his image, just like an English or Roman ruler. He also became a devout Christian. He made a pilgrimage to Rome in 1027. This was a huge journey for a northern king. He met the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. He negotiated better terms for English pilgrims and merchants traveling to Rome. He presented himself as a sophisticated Christian European monarch. He brought back relics for English churches. He gave generous gifts to monasteries. This wasn't just for show. His faith seems to have been genuine. He was building a new kind of kingdom, a North Sea empire held together by trade, a common faith, and his own personal authority. Cnut had transformed from a Viking warrior into a medieval statesman. He showed that a Norse ruler could be more than just a raider. He could be a king who brought peace and stability. Under his rule, England was peaceful and prosperous. There were no more Viking raids because the King of England was also the king of the Vikings. He controlled the sea lanes. He encouraged trade between England and Scandinavia. The old world of raiding was being replaced by a new world of organized commerce under the protection of a powerful king. And Cnut's empire didn't last long after his death in 1035. His sons were not as capable as he was. but his reign was a turning point. It showed how completely the Viking world had changed. The goal was no longer to sack a monastery for its gold. The goal was to rule a kingdom, to pass laws, to protect the church, and to be accepted as a legitimate king among the other rulers of Christendom. And Cnut was the ultimate example of the Viking transformed. Number 13, the mercenary who became a king. Before Harald Hardrada was the king of Norway who invaded England, he was a professional soldier. His story shows a different kind of transformation. The Viking warrior, once a free agent raiding for himself, could become a highly paid, disciplined mercenary in a foreign army. This was a career path for ambitious young men from the north. The most famous place for this was the Varangian Guard in Constantinople. The Byzantine emperors didn't trust their own people to protect them. They preferred to hire foreigners who had no local loyalties. For centuries, the best of these foreign bodyguards were Norsemen. They were called Varangians. Harald Sigurdsson arrived in Constantinople around 1034, and he was about 19 years old, a political refugee with nothing but his military skills. He quickly joined the guard. The life was good for a man like Harald. The pay was excellent. There were opportunities for plunder on campaign. And there was the prestige of serving the most powerful ruler in the Christian world. Harald was good at his job. He was tall, strong, and a natural leader. He rose through the ranks. He fought in the Emperor's Wars in the Mediterranean against Arab pirates. He fought in Sicily and in Bulgaria. He even went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He wasn't just a simple soldier. He was a commander, and he was very, very smart about money. Varangians had a legal right to scour the palace when an emperor died. This meant they could go through the treasury and take a certain amount of gold and valuables. Harald served under several emperors, so he had several opportunities to do this. He also amassed wealth through his command on campaigns. He was careful not to spend it. He had it converted to gold and jewels and sent it north to his friend, the ruler of Kievan Rus, for safekeeping. After about a decade of service, Harald was a wealthy and famous commander. But his time in Constantinople ended in trouble. He got involved in palace politics and was briefly imprisoned. He managed to escape, gathering some loyal followers. They commandeered a couple of ships in the harbor and sailed away. The story of his escape is dramatic, involving a chain across the harbor and a daring sea voyage. He went back to Kiev, picked up his fortune, married the prince's daughter, and then returned to Norway to claim a throne. Harald's career is a perfect example of this transformation. His warrior skills, the same skills that a raider used a century before, were now a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. He was part of an international military system. He learned about logistics, siege warfare, and court politics in the most sophisticated capital in the world. He was no longer just a Viking. He was a professional soldier of fortune. The Varangian Guard acted as a kind of finishing school for many future Scandinavian leaders. Well, they went to Constantinople as young warriors and came back as rich, experienced commanders with a much broader view of the world. This channeled the old Viking energy into a new direction. Instead of raiding the coasts of Europe, they were serving one of its great empires. The warrior spirit was still there, but it was now professionalized, monetized, and integrated into the larger political and military world of the 11th century. Number 12, a pirate's pledge on the River Seine. The Kingdom of the West Franks, what we now call France, had a Viking problem. For decades, starting in the early 9th century, longships had been sailing up the River Seine. They raided towns and monasteries, they sacked Paris multiple times, the Frankish kings tried everything. They paid them huge sums of silver to go away, which only encouraged them to come back for more. They fought them, but the Vikings were mobile and unpredictable. They built fortified bridges to try to block the rivers, but the Vikings just dragged their ships overland. In the year 911, a large Viking army was in the area around the city of Rouen. Their leader was a man named Rollo. We don't know for sure where he came from. Some sources say Denmark, others say Norway. He was a classic Viking leader, big, strong, and successful in war. He had been raiding the coasts of Francia for years. The Frankish king, Charles the Simple, was in a tough spot. He couldn't defeat Rollo's army, but he couldn't keep paying them off forever, so he tried a different idea. He sent a message to Rollo, he offered him a deal. Charles would give Rollo a large piece of land. It was the area around the mouth of the Seine, including the city of Rouen. This land would be his to rule as a duke. In return, Rollo had to do three things. First, he had to stop raiding and prevent any other Vikings from sailing up the Seine to raid. He had to become the defender of the kingdom, not its attacker. Second, he had to be baptized and become a Christian. Third, he had to swear loyalty to King Charles as his vassal. Rollo agreed. The deal was formalized in the Treaty of St. Clair sur Epte. Rollo and his men settled in the territory they were given. The land became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Rollo was baptized with the Christian name Robert. The story goes that when he was asked to kiss the king's foot as a sign of homage, he refused. He had one of his warriors do it for him. The warrior, instead of bending down, lifted the king's foot so high that he tipped the king over. It showed that even though they were becoming part of the Frankish system, they still had their pride. This was a brilliant solution for both sides. King Charles got a strong warrior to protect his kingdom's most vulnerable river. Rollo got land, titles, and legitimacy. He and his men could stop living a dangerous life of raiding and settle down as lords of a rich agricultural land. And the transformation was incredibly fast. Within a generation, Rollo's Vikings had adopted the French language. They married local women, they became devout Christians, they built churches and monasteries, they adopted the Frankish system of feudalism with knights on horseback. They became, in short, the Normans. A little over 150 years later, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson William would lead the Norman army across the English Channel to conquer England. The Normans were some of the most effective and organized warriors in Europe. Their culture was a hybrid. They had the military spirit and seafaring heritage of their Viking ancestors combined with French language, Christian religion, and continental military tactics. The story of Rollo shows the Viking raider turning into a feudal lord. It was a trade a longship for a title, a battle axe for a landed estate. The Vikings didn't just disappear from France, they became the French aristocracy in that region. They transformed so completely that they gave their name to the land itself. Number 11. The last stop on a westward journey. The Vikings were incredible sailors. They developed ships that could cross open oceans. This allowed them to go places no Europeans had gone before. They settled the Faroe Islands. In the late 9th century, they found Iceland. It was a large, uninhabited island. They moved there in large numbers, bringing their families and livestock. Iceland became a new Scandinavian society, a republic of farmers and chieftains. But they didn't stop there. From Iceland, a man named Eric the Red, who had been exiled for killing someone, sailed west. Around the year 982, he found an even larger island. It had a harsh landscape of rock and ice, but there were some green valleys on the southwestern coast. He wanted to attract settlers, so he gave it a good name, Greenland. He went back to Iceland and convinced a group of people to join him. So they established a colony in Greenland that would last for almost 500 years, but even Greenland wasn't the end of the line. Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson, heard stories of land even further west. Around the year 1000, he sailed from Greenland to see for himself. He found it. He and his crew landed in a new world. They described 3 different areas, one of flat stones, one of forests, and one with green meadows and wild grapes. They called this last place Vinland, the land of wine. This was North America, almost 500 years before Columbus. A few years after Leif's discovery, a wealthy Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni decided to try to establish a permanent settlement in Vinland. Around 1010, he organized a major expedition. He took 3 ships, about 160 people, including women, and all the livestock and supplies they would need to start a new life. They found Leif's old camp and settled there. We know from archaeological evidence found at L'Anse Os Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, that this story is true. The archaeologists found the remains of Norse-style turf houses and artifacts like a bronze pin and iron nails. At first, things went well. The land was rich. There was timber, which was very rare in Greenland. There was good grazing for their cattle. But they were not alone. They soon met the native people of the area, whom they called Skraelings. At first, the relationship was one of trade. The Norse traded milk and red cloth for furs, but misunderstandings and conflict soon followed. A fight broke out. Several people on both sides were killed. The small Norse community was thousands of miles from home. They were completely on their own. The local population was hostile. After about 3 years, Karlsefni and the others decided it wasn't worth it. The risk was too great. They packed up and sailed back to Greenland and then to Iceland. Thorfinn Karlsefni had a son named Snorri, who was born in Vinland, the first European known to have been born in the Americas. The Vinland experiment shows the limits of Viking expansion. They had the technology to get there, but they didn't have the resources to stay. They didn't have the population numbers or the political organization to support a colony so far from home against a hostile population. The Viking Age was driven by expansion, by finding new lands to raid or settle. In Vinland, they found the end of the world they could realistically control. The westward push ran out of steam. This was a crucial part of the transformation. When the opportunities for easy expansion and settlement dried up, the focus had to turn inward. Scandinavian societies had to develop and stabilize in the lands they already held, rather than constantly looking for the next new shore. The dream of Vinland died, and with it, a part of the old Viking impulse to always keep moving west. Number 10, a law speaker's decision at the Thingvellir. Iceland was a unique place in the Viking world. It was settled in the late 9th century by Norse people, mostly from Norway, who were looking for new land and freedom from the growing power of kings. They created a new kind of society. It had no king. It was a republic governed by a collection of local chieftains. Once a year, for 2 weeks in the summer, these chieftains and any free man who wanted to come would gather at a place called Thingvellir, the Assembly Plains. This assembly was called the Althing. It was the oldest parliament in the world. Here they would make laws, settle disputes, and hold trials. By the late 10th century, Iceland was facing a problem. A new religion, Christianity, was sweeping across Europe. Scandinavia was converting. The king of Norway, Olaf Tryggvason, was a very forceful Christian. He was putting pressure on Iceland to convert too. He had even taken some sons of Icelandic chieftains hostage to force the issue. In Iceland itself, the society was splitting apart. Some chieftains and their families had converted to Christianity. Many others wanted to stick to the old gods, to Odin and Thor. The two sides were becoming increasingly hostile. There was a real danger of civil war. In the summer of the year 1000, the Althing met as usual. The religious question was the main topic. The tension was high. Both the Christian and the pagan factions came armed. It looked like a fight was about to break out, but they decided to try to solve the problem the Icelandic way through law and negotiation. They agreed to appoint one person to make a decision for the whole island. This was a common practice for difficult legal cases. They chose the law speaker, a man named Thorgeir Thorkelson. He was a pagan chieftain, but he was known for being wise and fair. Thorgeir took the responsibility seriously. The story says he went to his tent and lay down under a fur cloak for a whole day and night, thinking. He was considering the problem from all angles. He knew that if he decided for the old gods, the king of Norway would likely invade. Iceland had no army to defend itself. If he decided for Christianity, he risked a civil war with the pagan chieftains. The next day, he came out and went to the Law Rock, the place where decisions were announced. Everyone gathered to listen. He said that it was a terrible thing for a people to have two different laws. He said, if we tear apart the laws, we will also tear apart the peace. He had decided that for the sake of unity, everyone in Iceland should be Christian and be baptized. That would be the law of the land. This was a huge victory for the Christian faction, but then he added some compromises. He said that people could still practice the old religion in private. They could still eat horse meat, which was a pagan ritual forbidden by the church, and they could continue the old practice of exposing unwanted newborn infants. These were major concessions. With this compromise, both sides were able to accept the decision. There was no civil war. The people were baptized in the nearby hot springs. Iceland became a Christian country peacefully by a legal and political decision made by its own people. This event is a powerful example of the Viking world transforming. The old way of solving a problem might have been with an axe. The new way was with debate, compromise, and law. The Althing itself was a sophisticated political institution. The decision to convert was not just about religion. It was a calculated political choice to join the rest of Europe, to maintain good relations with Norway, and most importantly, to preserve the unity and independence of the Icelandic Commonwealth. It was a sign that this society was moving beyond the warrior culture of its ancestors and becoming a structured, law-abiding state. Number 9, the king who broke the old gods. Not every conversion to Christianity was as peaceful as Iceland's. In Norway, it was a brutal and bloody affair driven by the ambition of one man, Olaf Tryggvason. Olaf had a dramatic life story. He was born around 960, the son of a Norwegian petty king. His father was killed, and he grew up in exile in the court of the Kievan Ruses. As a young man, he became a successful Viking raider. He led fleets that attacked England and other parts of Europe. He was a classic Viking hero, skilled in battle and clever in strategy. During his time raiding, he spent time in England. Sometime around the year 994, he was baptized. He had a religious experience, or perhaps he just saw which way the political winds were blowing. Being a Christian king gave you legitimacy in the eyes of other European rulers. With his new faith, he returned to Norway in 995. The country was then ruled by a Danish vassal. Olaf quickly gained support and was declared king. His main goal was to unite Norway under his rule and make it a Christian kingdom. He went about this with a single-minded, violent fanaticism. He traveled from region to region, calling the local chieftains and farmers to an assembly, a thing. He would give them a choice, accept baptism in the new god, or fight him. Many chose to fight. Olaf was a ruthless commander. He defeated his opponents in battle. He tortured and killed those who resisted. There are gruesome stories of him executing pagan leaders in cruel ways to make an example of them. He burned down pagan temples. He smashed idols of Thor and Odin. His methods were effective, if brutal. In just 5 years, he had established Christianity as the official religion throughout most of Norway. He was building a new kind of kingdom, one based on the European model. The king was not just the most powerful chieftain. He was God's representative on earth. The church provided a structure of administration with bishops and priests who were loyal to the king. It helped to break the power of the old local chieftains, who were often also the pagan priests. Olaf's reign was short. In the year 1000, he was ambushed by a combined fleet of his enemies, the Swedes, the Danes, and his rivals in Norway. In a great sea battle called the Battle of Svolder, his fleet was destroyed. Rather than be captured, Olaf is said to have jumped overboard in his full armor and was never seen again. He became a legendary figure, a martyr for the Christian cause in Norway. Olaf's story shows a key aspect of the transformation. The Viking Age ended in part because the leaders of the Viking homelands themselves forced it to end. Men like Olaf used the new religion as a tool for state building. By destroying the old pagan religion, they were also destroying the old decentralized power structure that went with it. They were replacing a collection of independent-minded chieftains with a centralized Christian monarchy. This made their kingdoms more like the rest of Europe. It made them more stable internally. It also meant the end of the kind of freelance raiding that had defined the early Viking Age. The king wanted to control all the violence in his kingdom. The Viking raider became an outlaw, an enemy of the new Christian state. The transformation was happening from the top down, and it was often enforced with a sword. Number 8, the men who came down the rivers. The story of the Viking Age is not just about Western Europe. To the east, another great transformation was taking place. The vast network of rivers that flows through modern-day Russia and Ukraine was a highway for Scandinavian traders and warriors. They came from Sweden mostly. The local Slavic and Finnic tribes called them the Ruses. This might have come from an Old Norse word for the men who row. Starting in the late 8th century, these Ruses traveled down the rivers. They were looking for silver, silks, and other luxury goods from the Byzantine Empire and the Arab Caliphate. They were tough and they were organized. They would drag their ships overland from one river system to another. They established fortified trading posts along the way. Places like Staraya, Ladoga, and Novgorod. They weren't just trading. They were also imposing their rule on the local tribes. They demanded tribute, mostly in the form of furs, honey, and slaves. According to a historical account called the Russian Primary Chronicle, written a few centuries later, the local tribes got tired of fighting among themselves. In the year 862, they decided to invite a Rus leader to come and rule over them and bring order. They sent a message overseas that said, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." Three brothers Rurik, Cineas, and Truvor answered the call. Rurik settled in Novgorod and became the founder of a dynasty that would rule Russia for over 700 years. Whether this invitation really happened is debated by historians. It's more likely that the Ruses imposed their rule by force. But the result was the same. A small group of Scandinavian elites came to rule over a much larger Slavic population. They established a new state, Kievan Rus'. The capital eventually moved south to Kiev, a city with a strategic position on the Dnieper River, on the main trade route to Constantinople. This was the Varangian Road to the Greeks. The transformation here was different from in England or France. The number of Scandinavians was relatively small. They were a ruling class. They quickly began to assimilate. First, they took Slavic names. They intermarried with the local nobility. Within a few generations, they were speaking the local Slavic language. But they brought their organizational skills, their military prowess, and their long-distance trade connections. They created a powerful and wealthy state. Rulers like Oleg, who captured Kiev, and Igor and Sviatoslav were still very much Viking in their behavior. And they led campaigns to raid the surrounding territories and even attacked Constantinople itself. The biggest transformation came in the late 10th century. The ruler of Kievan Rus' was a man named Vladimir the Great. He decided that his state needed a single official religion to unify its diverse peoples. The story goes that he sent envoys to study the different religions of the world. They looked at Islam, Judaism, and Western Christianity. But the envoys who went to Constantinople were amazed by the beauty of the Hagia Sophia and the Orthodox Christian service. They reported back, "We no longer knew whether we were in heaven or on earth." In 988, Vladimir was baptized into the Orthodox faith. He then ordered the mass baptism of his people in the Dnieper River. This was a decisive moment. By adopting Eastern Orthodox Christianity, Kievan Rus' tied its destiny to the Byzantine Empire, not to Rome and Western Europe. The state founded by Vikings became the ancestor of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Ruses, the Vikings of the East, didn't just end their age of raiding. They transformed into the founders and rulers of a new civilization. The old Norse gods were forgotten, and the warrior elite became the defenders of a new Christian faith. The longship was replaced by the onion dome as the symbol of their power. Number 7, the ledger and the longship. Not every Viking was a warrior. Many were merchants, and the Viking Age was as much an age of trade as it was an age of raids. Sometimes the two went together. A Viking fleet might raid one town and then sail to another to trade the goods they had just stolen. But over time, trade became more important, more profitable, and more stable than raiding. This economic shift was one of the most important reasons the Viking Age transformed. Imagine a man named Bjorn living around the year 850. He's not a chieftain or a famous warrior. He's a merchant living in a town like Hedeby on the border of Denmark and Germany, or Birka in Sweden. These were some of the first true commercial centers in Scandinavia. They were bustling, cosmopolitan places. People from all over the known world came there. You could hear Norse, German, Slavic, and Arabic spoken in the streets. You could buy Frankish glass, English pottery, wine from the Rhine Valley, and silks from the Far East. Bjorn's life is governed by risk and reward. He might own a share in a trading ship, a nar. This was a different kind of ship from the longship. It was wider, deeper, and slower, designed to carry cargo, not warriors. In the spring, he loads his ship with goods from the North furs from deep in the Russian forests, walrus ivory from Greenland, amber from the Baltic coast, and enslaved people captured in raids. He sails south to a market town. There he trades his goods for silver. The Arabs in particular had a huge demand for furs and slaves and a seemingly endless supply of silver coins called dirhams. Thousands of these coins have been found in hoards all over Scandinavia. Bjorn doesn't use the coins as money in the way we do. He doesn't care about the face on the coin. He cares about the weight and purity of the silver. He carries a small portable set of scales. Every transaction involves carefully weighing out pieces of silver, which could be coins, arm rings, or just chopped up bits of jewelry called hack silver. This was a bullion economy. Your wealth was the weight of the silver you held. But by the late 10th century, the life of a merchant was changing. On towns like Hedeby were becoming more organized. Kings were starting to see the value of trade. They offered protection to merchants in exchange for taxes. They started to mint their own coins. A king like Harald Bluetooth in Denmark or Cnut the Great in England put his own name and face on a coin. This was a guarantee of its weight and purity. You no longer had to weigh every piece of silver, you could just count the coins. This made trade faster, easier, and more reliable. The flow of Arabic silver also began to dry up in the late 10th century due to political changes in the Islamic world. The merchants had to find new sources of wealth. They found it in the developing economies of Europe. Instead of just trading luxury goods for silver, they became more involved in the trade of bulk goods, grain, fish, timber, and wool. This required more organization, more sophisticated markets, and more stable political conditions. The raider lives for the big score, the one successful raid that makes him rich. The merchant lives for the steady, predictable profit. As Scandinavian society became more commercial, it became more stable. People had more to lose from the chaos of raiding. A king who could guarantee safe roads and safe harbors for merchants was more valuable than a chieftain who promised loot from a dangerous sea voyage. The economic focus shifted from taking wealth to creating it. The scales of the merchant, used to weigh silver, became just as important as the warrior's axe. And in the long run, the logic of the marketplace was more powerful than the logic of the raid. Number 6, a new fence in a northern field. The Vikings are famous for leaving, but the biggest story is about them staying. In the late 9th century, a large Viking army called the Great Heathen Army had been campaigning in England for years. They had conquered 3 of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Only Wessex, under Alfred the Great, held out. After years of fighting, Alfred and the Viking leader Guthrum made a treaty around the year 886. The treaty divided England in 2. Alfred would rule the south and west. Guthrum and his army would take the north and east. This area became known as the Danelaw. This was a huge turning point. The Viking army stopped being an army and started to be a population. The warriors settled down, they were given land, they became farmers. Imagine a man named Thorstein. He was a warrior in the Great Army. He's maybe in his 30s. He spent his whole adult life fighting. Now, he's given a plot of land in what is now Lincolnshire or Yorkshire. He has to build a house, he has to clear the fields. He has to learn to plow, to sow, and to reap. He's not alone. His whole community is doing the same thing. They settle in villages alongside the existing English population. Sometimes they take over existing villages. Sometimes they create new ones. We can still see their influence on the map of England today. Place names that end in by, like Grimsby or Derby, come from the Old Norse word for village or farm. Place names ending in Thorpe meant an outlying settlement. Place names ending in Thwaite meant a clearing. The map of northern England is a record of this Viking settlement. At first, Thorstein and his English neighbor, maybe a man named Edward, are probably suspicious of each other. Sure, they speak different languages, although Old Norse and Old English were related, so they could probably make themselves understood. They worship different gods, but they are neighbors. Their children play together. They have to cooperate to manage the land. Maybe Thorstein's cow wanders into Edward's field. Maybe they trade tools. Then Thorstein needs a wife. There aren't many Scandinavian women in England, so he marries an English woman, maybe Edward's daughter, Edith. Now, they are family. Their children will grow up speaking both languages. They will probably be given a name that is a mix of the two cultures, like Oswald, which combines a Norse and an English element. Here they will be baptized in the local Christian church because that is Edith's faith. Within a generation or two, Thorstein's grandchildren don't think of themselves as Vikings or Danes. They think of themselves as English, they live in England, they speak English, and they are Christians. This process of assimilation happened all over the Danelaw. It wasn't always peaceful, but on a day-to-day level, people found ways to live together. The Vikings brought new words into the English language. Words like sky, skin, leg, window, husband, wife, and law all come from Old Norse. They brought their own legal customs and ideas about land ownership, which influenced the development of English law. Archaeology shows us this mixing. We find graves with a mixture of pagan, Viking, and Christian English burial practices. And we find jewelry and art that blends Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon styles. The Viking as a raider, an outsider, was a threat. But the Viking as a farmer, a neighbor, a husband, was just another part of the community. This process of settling down and mixing with the local population was one of the most powerful forces that ended the Viking Age. The Vikings didn't just go away. They became us, they became the English, the Irish, the Scots. The very identity of the people they once raided was changed by their decision to stay. The fence Thorstein built around his new field was more than just a boundary for his land. It was a symbol of him putting down roots, of his transformation from a mobile warrior to a settled farmer. Number 5, the walls that broke the wave. In the early Viking Age, the raiders had a huge advantage. They were unpredictable, they could strike anywhere, anytime. Their longships could travel in shallow water, allowing them to go far up rivers and attack towns that thought they were safe. The kingdoms of Europe were large, decentralized, and slow to react. By the time a local lord could gather his army, the Vikings would be gone, back on their ships with their loot. But by the late 9th century, things started to change. People learned from experience. They started to adapt. One of the best examples of this was the siege of Paris in 885 to 886. Paris at that time was not the huge city it is today. It was a small fortified island in the middle of the River Seine, the Ile de la Cite. It was important because it had 2 fortified bridges that blocked river traffic. For Vikings wanting to sail further up the Seine to raid the rich lands of Burgundy, Paris was in the way. In November 885, a massive Viking fleet arrived. Sources say there were 700 ships and tens of thousands of men. This is probably an exaggeration, but it was a huge force. They demanded to be allowed to pass. The defenders of Paris, led by Count Odo and the local bishop, refused. So, the Vikings began a siege. They expected the city to fall quickly, as it had before, but this time was different. The Parisians had strengthened their walls. They had built towers on the bridges. They were prepared to fight. The siege lasted for almost a year. The Vikings used all the tactics they knew. They built siege engines like battering rams and catapults. They tried to set fire to the bridges. They tunneled under the walls. Every time the defenders fought them off. Count Odo was a brilliant and brave leader. He organized the defense, led counterattacks, and even managed to sneak through the Viking lines to go and get help from the Frankish king. The defenders suffered terribly. They ran out of food. There was disease, but they held on. The Viking army also suffered. They were a force designed for quick raids, not for a long static siege. They had to feed their huge army. They couldn't just live off the land forever. Disease also spread through their camp. Their morale began to drop. The failure to take Paris was a major blow to their prestige. Finally, the Frankish king, Charles the Fat, arrived with a large relief army. But instead of fighting the Vikings, he made a deal with them. He paid them 700 pounds of silver to leave Paris, and he gave them permission to go and raid Burgundy, which was a region in rebellion against him anyway. The defenders of Paris were furious. They had fought so hard, and now the king was just paying the enemy to go and attack someone else. But the siege was over. The siege of Paris was a turning point. It showed that Vikings could be defeated. Well-defended, fortified places could resist them. The old tactics of hit and run were less effective against a network of walls and bridges. After this, kings and lords all over Europe started investing in defense. In England, Alfred the Great built a network of fortified towns called burhs. In Francia, lords began to build private castles. These fortifications changed the military landscape. They gave local populations a place to shelter. They gave local lords a secure base from which to operate. This defensive transformation raised the cost of raiding. It was no longer easy or low risk. A Viking army might spend months besieging a single town and come away with nothing. The profits were no longer guaranteed. This forced a change in strategy. It was one of the key reasons why raiding slowly gave way to other activities like trade, settlement, or serving as mercenaries. The Viking wave didn't just run out of energy. It broke against the new walls that Europe had learned to build. Number 4. The King's Stone and the New Order. In the town of Jelling in Denmark stand 2 large carved stones. They are known as the Jelling Stones. The smaller stone was raised by a king named Gorm the Old in the mid-10th century. It honors his wife Thyra. The larger stone was raised by their son Harald Bluetooth. It is a massive 3-sided stone intricately carved. On one side is an image of a great beast fighting a snake. On another is the earliest depiction of Jesus Christ in Scandinavia. And on the third side is a runic inscription. The inscription is a boast, a political statement that changed a country. It says, King Haraldr ordered this monument made in memory of Gormr, his father, and in memory of Thurv, his mother, that Haraldr, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christian. This stone is sometimes called Denmark's birth certificate. It tells us about the massive transformation happening in Scandinavia itself. Harald Bluetooth, who ruled from about 958 to 986, was a nation builder. Before him, Denmark was a loose collection of tribes and chieftains. Harald used a combination of military force, diplomacy, and engineering to unite these different groups under his single rule. He won for himself all of Denmark. This was a new idea in Scandinavia. The old way was a system of petty kings and powerful local jarls or earls. Harald was creating a centralized kingdom like the ones in the rest of Europe. To do this, he needed infrastructure. He built a series of impressive circular fortresses known as Trelleborg fortresses. They were perfectly circular with gates at the 4 points of the compass and laid out with geometric precision. These were not just defensive structures, they were bases for his royal army. They were symbols of the king's power stamped onto the landscape. They showed that the king could command the resources and manpower to build on a massive scale. And then there was the third part of his inscription. He made the Danes Christian. Like Olaf Tryggvason in Norway, Harald saw Christianity as a powerful tool for unifying his kingdom. A single religion with a single god helped to support the idea of a single king. The church provided an administrative structure with bishops who were loyal to the king and could help him govern. It also improved his standing with his powerful southern neighbor, the Holy Roman Empire. Adopting Christianity was a way of joining the club of civilized European nations. The Jelling Stone is the perfect symbol of this transformation. It's written in runes, the old script of the North, but it proclaims the arrival of a new religion from the south. It's a monument to Harald's pagan parents, but it's dominated by the image of Christ. It boasts of conquest in the old Viking way, but the conquest it describes is the creation of a stable, unified kingdom. Harald was a transitional figure. He was a Viking king who ended the Viking way of life in his own country. By centralizing power, building a national army, and establishing a national church, kings like Harald were changing the very society that produced the Viking raiders. Young men could no longer just gather a crew and go raiding. When they felt like it, the king wanted to control that military power. He wanted them in his army, defending the kingdom or fighting his wars. The Viking homelands were ceasing to be the source of the problem and were becoming part of the European solution. They were becoming organized states, and that was one of the biggest reasons the Viking Age transformed. Number 3, from hack-silver to the king's face. In the early Viking Age, wealth was simple, it was silver, it didn't matter if it was a coin from Baghdad, a piece of a church cross from Ireland, or a bracelet from France. All that mattered was how much it weighed and how pure it was. A Viking warrior's wealth was portable. He might carry it in a pouch or wear it as a heavy silver arm ring. When he needed to buy something, he would take out a knife, chop a piece off the arm ring, and weigh it on his small portable scales. This is what we call a bullion economy. The silver itself was the value. This system, known as hack silver, worked well for a mobile raiding society. Now, imagine you are in the city of Jorvik, the Viking name for York, in the mid-10th century. Jorvik was the capital of the Viking kingdom in northern England. It was a thriving city, a major center for manufacturing and trade, and something new was happening here. The Viking kings of Jorvik were minting their own coins, lots of them. A man working in the mint in Jorvik would have a busy and precise job. He would receive silver, perhaps from a merchant or from the king's own treasury. This silver would be melted down and mixed with a specific amount of other metals to create an alloy of the correct standard. Then it would be hammered into thin sheets, and then discs called blanks would be cut from the sheets. The final step was striking. A blank would be placed between two dies, metal stamps with a design carved into them. The top die would be hit hard with a hammer, impressing the design onto the coin. The designs on these coins were fascinating. They were a blend of cultures. Some coins had the name of the Viking king, like Eric Bloodaxe or Citric Silkbeard. But they would write their names using the Latin alphabet of the English, not the runes of their ancestors. Some coins had Viking symbols like a sword or a raven, but others had Christian symbols like a cross. This shows that the Viking rulers of Jorvik were trying to appeal to both the Scandinavian and the English populations they ruled over. They were presenting themselves as both Viking warriors and legitimate Christian kings. The move from hack silver to a managed, minted currency was a huge transformation. It shows a society that is becoming more stable, more commercial, and more politically organized. A king who mints his own coins is making a powerful statement. He is saying, I control the economy. I guarantee the value of this money. It makes trade much easier. You know, a merchant doesn't have to carry scales and test every piece of silver. You know, he can just count the coins. It allows the king to collect taxes more efficiently. It helps to create a shared economic identity. When you use a coin with the king's face on it, you are participating in his system. You are acknowledging his authority. The Viking kings of Jorvik understood this, so did other rulers like Cnut the Great, who minted high-quality coins that were accepted all over northern Europe. The widespread adoption of coinage was a sign that the Viking world was moving away from the chaotic, informal economy of the raid and towards the structured, regulated economy of a medieval state. The small silver penny mass-produced in a workshop in York was a more powerful agent of change than a longship full of warriors. It was a sign that the Vikings were no longer just taking wealth, they were learning to manage it. Number 2, the Jarl who lost his freedom. For centuries, the basic unit of Scandinavian society was the local community, led by a powerful chieftain or Jarl. A man like this, let's call him Leif, lived in a large longhouse on his family's land on a fjord in western Norway. This was around the year 870. Leif's power came from his land, his wealth, and the number of free farmers and warriors who were loyal to him. He was a leader in his community, he hosted feasts in his longhouse, he led religious ceremonies to honor the old gods. He acted as a judge in local disputes, and when the time was right, in the spring, he would call his men to their longship. They would go a Viking. This was a part of their way of life. It was how a young man could gain wealth and a reputation. It was how a Jarl like Leif could reward his followers and increase his own power and prestige. This was a seasonal activity, a private enterprise. It was not directed by any king or central government. Leif's primary loyalty was to his family and his own men. He was his own boss. Then a man named Harald Fairhair came to power. Harald was the king of a small part of Norway, but he had a big ambition. He wanted to be the king of all of Norway. The sagas say he made a vow not to cut or comb his hair until he had achieved this goal. For years, he fought a series of wars against the other petty kings and jarls. He was a brilliant military leader, and one by one, he defeated them. Around the year 872, he won a final, decisive naval battle at Hafrsfjord. After this battle, he was the undisputed ruler of a united Norway. This was a disaster for a man like Leif. He now had a choice. He could submit to King Harald. This meant he would have to pay taxes to the king. He would have to provide men for the king's army. He could no longer go raiding whenever he wanted. The king claimed a monopoly on violence. Leif could perhaps keep his title as Jarl, but he would now be the king's representative, not an independent ruler. He would be part of a new centralized system. Or he could leave. Many Jarls and free farmers who valued their independence chose this option. They packed up their families and their belongings, loaded them onto their ships, and sailed away, This is one of the traditional explanations for the settlement of Iceland. Iceland was a new land with no king. There they could recreate the old, free society they had lost. Harald Fairhair's unification of Norway was a pivotal moment. It shows that the transformation of the Viking Age was not just something happening in the lands the Vikings raided. It was happening at home. The very societies that produced the raiders were changing. The rise of centralized monarchies in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden ended the old decentralized way of life. This process created a new kind of stability, but it also closed the frontier of private warfare. The Viking raid as a freelance enterprise was becoming obsolete and illegal. The warrior energy of the Scandinavian people was now channeled into the service of the king. A man who wanted to fight now joined the royal army. The old freedom of the independent Jarl was gone. The creation of the Scandinavian kingdoms was a necessary step towards becoming modern European nations. But it was also the end of the world that had made the early Viking Age possible. The transformation was not just about Vikings changing when they went abroad. It was about their entire world changing at home. Number 1. The tool that changed the world. It all started with a tree, and an axe, and a new idea about how to build a boat. The single most important piece of technology in the Viking Age was the longship. Without it, there would have been no Viking Age. This ship was the key that unlocked the world for the Norse people. It was a masterpiece of design and engineering. Imagine a shipbuilder, a man named Eric, working in a Danish forest around the year 750. He is not building a ship the way a Roman or a Frank would. He is using a method that has been perfected over generations in Scandinavia. He starts by finding the right trees, tall, straight oaks. He doesn't saw them into planks. That would cut across the grain of the wood and make it weaker. Instead, he and his team split the logs into long, thin planks using wedges and axes. This method follows the grain of the wood, making the planks incredibly strong and flexible. The keel, the backbone of the ship, is made from a single straight tree. This gives the ship its strength. Then, the planks are attached to the keel. This is the crucial part, the clinker-built technique. Each plank overlaps the one below it, like shingles on a roof. They are fastened together with iron rivets. This creates a hull that is both strong and light, and it's flexible. In rough seas, a clinker-built hull can twist and bend with the waves, absorbing their energy instead of breaking. And Eric and his team designed the ship to be long, narrow, and shallow. It has a sail, a single large square sail for crossing open oceans. But it also has places for oarsmen, perhaps 30 on each side. This means the ship doesn't need the wind. It can be rowed up rivers against the current. In its shallow draft, the amount of the ship that is below the water is very important. It means the ship can travel in water only a few feet deep. It can land on any flat beach. It doesn't need a deep harbor. This ship was a multi-purpose tool. It was a troop transport. It could carry 60 or more warriors and all their gear. It was a trading vessel. It could carry cargo. It was an explorer's craft. It could cross the cold, rough North Atlantic. This versatility was its genius. The same ship that could be used for a lightning raid on a monastery in England could also be used to carry a merchant's goods to a market in Francia, or to take a family of settlers to a new life in Iceland. The longship gave the Norse people a strategic advantage that no one else in Europe had. They had mobility. They could appear out of nowhere, strike and disappear before any defense could be organized. For the first century or so of the Viking Age, Europe had no answer to this. But the ship itself is just a tool. A tool can be used for different purposes. In the beginning of the Viking Age, the longship was primarily a weapon, a tool for raiding and conquest. As the age progressed, the tool was used differently. The Nar, a wider, deeper cargo ship based on the same clinker-built technology, became more common. This was the ship of the trader and the settler. The transformation of the Viking Age is mirrored in the use of their ships. The same technology that allowed a warrior to raid Lindisfarne in 793 was used by a merchant to trade in Hedeby in 850, and by a settler like Thorfinn Karlsefni to try to build a new life in Vinland around 1010. The ship didn't change that much, but the purpose of the voyage did. The shift from the longship as a raiding platform to the Nar as a trading vessel is a perfect summary of the entire transformation. The Viking Age didn't just end, it transformed when the people who built the greatest ships of their time decided to use them not just to take, but to trade, to settle, and to build. The journey changed from a raid to a business trip, from a voyage of plunder to a voyage of purpose.